Bishop Robert Stearns is the founder and executive director of Eagle's Wings, and for over 30 years, he has been a trailblazer in building bridges of friendship between Christians and Jews. Recognized globally as one of the leading voices in this field, his work has shaped conversations and fostered understanding in profound ways.
I don't care if you're Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, queer, straight, whatever you are, you should be concerned about what's happening in this conflict.
Having traveled to Israel over 100 times and led strategic initiatives in more than 30 nations, Bishop Stearns brings unparalleled insight and experience to the table.
There has been so much money thrown at this situation that every Palestinian probably, I'd have to do the math, but probably each of them could have received $1 million by now.
In this episode, we dive into the often debated term Christian Zionism, exploring its meaning and implications. Bishop Stearns, thank you so much for joining me today. Really excited for this conversation. Just so we're clear, where are you calling from? Where are you right now?
I'm in New York. Yes, I live in New York. And Mike, it's great to see you and excited to be on with you today.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this is one of the most important conversations I think we could be having, because many people who've come to listen to this, I kind of imagine there'll be a group of three people. There'll be some folks who are Christians and they saw Christian Zionism and they're thinking this is really interesting. There'll be folks who are Muslim and again, they're interested in the sort of Christian Zionist perspective. And most of our audience, I think, are just sick of seeing people dying. They're tired of conflict and they're just thinking you might be able to help us with thinking about how we get to some sort of resolution, right, on this, because you have a very unique perspective, I would say, by virtue of being involved in this region for a long, long time. So let's start maybe there. People saw your name, they saw Bishop Robert Stearns. Some will think, what is Bishop? Does he play chess? What's going on? So if we started there, how would you kind of explain who you are, what it is you do?
Well, I move diagonally. Right, bishops move diagonally. So that's what I do. No, so a bishop in the Christian world, in the tradition that I grew up in, you have pastors who oversee a local congregation, and then you have a bishop who would be a pastor of pastors. So I have a local congregation that I oversee here in New York. We're almost a century old, our church, so it's kind of an iconic church. Of course, that is very young compared to UK standards, but in America, that's kind of an older congregation. We're about a century old, and then we have many other churches and nonprofits, some orphanages, some homes where we're rescuing trafficked children in Asia. So we have a number of different humanitarian outreaches and churches, and I oversee that whole network. So that's hence the title bishop.
Thank you for explaining, and I think it's important because one of the first questions someone actually asked me when I told them I would be speaking to you, they said, as a Christian, how does he feel about what's happening? So Israel and Palestine, October the 7th is when for a lot of people it kind of came up in our radar. The truth is, as you know, there's been lots happening before then. But when you think about all the back and forths and the news we keep hearing of, there's another attack, there's an attack. As a Christian, how does it all make you feel?
Well, I mean, yes, as a Christian, but I would also say as a human being, it's tragic, it's heartbreaking, it is horrific, and so painful. And I'm so grateful to voices like yours that are raising the issue. And I love the name of your podcast, right? The Common Sense Podcast, or Common Sense, because we seem to be living in a world that is being polarized. It feels to me like the algorithm is seeking to consistently demonize the other and push us through fear and through deception into these intense, polarized, opposite camps. And so, yes, I approach this as a Christian, of course, but I also approach it as just a member of the human family. And what is happening is tragic and heartbreaking. And every caring human being, I don't care if you're Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, queer, straight, whatever you are, you should be concerned about what's happening in this conflict and working for peace.
I'm really curious to know how this all began for you and how you yourself, I mean, it's been over 30 years that your organization has been involved in Israel. I imagine for yours it's probably longer personally. How did this all begin, your sort of, engagement, if you like, with the Middle East and that region?
So it's a great question. So it started for me with a trip to Israel. I was not... I don't have any geopolitical background. I didn't, interfaith dialogue was not my thing. None of this was on my radar at all. I was in my 20s. I graduated from seminary. And I had finished one position of ministry and I was about to shift to another. And I had this 4-month block that was kind of open on my calendar. And I came across an advertisement. I joke and say, it was a brochure because in those days there was not Instagram, there was not, none of this. So it's amazing to think back to those days, but it was just a brochure and you could volunteer for 6 weeks for this Christian ministry in Jerusalem. And I thought, well, that'd be a cool thing to do. I've got this block of time that's open. Yeah, I'll go for 6 weeks and I can see some sights. And I was just kind of intellectually curious. But I might have gone to volunteer in Guatemala or in Kuala Lumpur. It was just, it wasn't a specific drawing to Israel. But I got there for that 6 weeks, and that 6 weeks became almost 2 years. I stayed for almost 2 years. And that experience just radically transformed my life. It changed my life as a Christian, as a human being. It changed my perspective on everything, on God, on the Bible, on history, on geopolitics. It changed everything. So that was the one trip that now has led, and you're correct, that trip was before I started our organization. That trip was in 1992. And now, fast forward, I don't count anymore. I've been to the Holy Land more than 100 times. I've led over 35,000 people there. And am profoundly engaged in all of these issues. So yeah, but it all started with one trip.
And that's really notable, because what that means is your experience of that region is materially different to folks who've never been, but also folks who their engagement is articles, videos, that sort of stuff. What are some of the misconceptions that people have about Israel from being there so many times that, again, to my listeners in the West, you could shed light on?
Right. So, yeah, I would say also it is different in the sense that, I'm not Jewish. I have no Jewish background whatsoever. And I was not particularly interested in Israel. This was not I never thought my life would go in this direction. I'm actually a musician. I'm a trained musician. I have 2 degrees, one in theology, one in music. And so that was the direction of my life until all of this happened. So listen, what misconceptions are there? The better question is, what misconceptions are there not? Because it really... it's so difficult to unpack how much is misconstrued about the reality of the place and the conflict and the people. I think one of the first, and can I take a step back for a moment and let me just say this. I would say that Jerusalem brought me to Israel, right? I wanted to volunteer for that thing. It was interesting. It's the land of the Bible. I grew up reading Bible stories. But I like to say that Jerusalem brought me to Israel, but Tel Aviv kept me in Israel. And what I mean by that is, you know, Jerusalem is one of the most ancient cities on earth. It's the holy city for three great monotheistic religions. But Tel Aviv is this vibrant, mostly secular city, very comparable to a London or a New York City, home to the largest gay pride parade in the Middle East and one of the largest gay pride parades in the world. And this kind of bustling center of really liberalism. And so somehow Israel manages to inculcate these realities and allow them to kind of peacefully coexist together. So I think if there's anything that I would hope out of today's podcast would be that I would issue people an invitation to look deeper. I would issue people an invitation to look past, you know, the BBC soundbite, look past, you know, the latest horrible headline. And the headlines are horrible. No one is denying the headlines are horrific. But we have to ask, what is the why behind the headline? What is the true depth of this conflict? So to go to your question, you know, what are some of the greatest misconceptions? I mean, I'll just go to one of them that comes off the top of my head, which is this accusation of Israel being an apartheid state. And of course, if we look at South Africa, if we look at the definition of apartheid and the reality of apartheid, which of course we think of South Africa as the place where that term came from, but I think of America back pre-Dr. Martin Luther King and what we call the Jim Crow laws, you know, the segregation, the racism, the systemic racism that was present in America and that was codified in our legal system and in our educational system. And then you go to Israel today, and honestly, I'm not exaggerating, within 2 hours of being there, people will turn to me and they'll say, well, wait a minute. Like, I'll give you an example. When we, if we all remember COVID, right? And we were bringing groups during the COVID time, and when you landed, you had to get testing. You had to get testing when you landed, you know, the instant test at the airport. They would test everyone. And we would bring groups through. And the doctors running the tests, I mean, here's Arab doctors, here's Muslim doctors running the whole department at the airport. And they're like, wait, I thought this was an apartheid state. I thought Muslims were persecuted against. I thought Muslims couldn't, you know, function in this society. How are they running the medical clinic that's running, by the way, high security clearance here at the airport, running this testing program? And then you start to unpack, wait a minute, there's 15 Muslim Arab members of the Knesset, of the parliament. Okay, so that's greater than 10% of the parliamentarians, elected parliamentarians, are Muslims. And you just start to see literally, I'm not exaggerating, literally within hours, you're like, well, wait a second, this is obviously not apartheid. I mean, there are no, like, here's the Muslim bathroom and here's the bathroom for everyone. I mean, this doesn't exist. I mean, Muslim Arabs are at full parity with every other people group within Israel. So this is one, like, of the low-lying fruit misconceptions that you immediately see when you get there. And that just starts to unravel, you know, all of these other, I think another major misconception is that there's nothing but horror and conflict between the Jews and the Arabs and the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians. You take one walk through the old city of Jerusalem and you see Muslim shopkeepers and Jewish shopkeepers who are dear friends who've lived next to each other for 25 years and their kids are friends and they're sharing each other's holidays, et cetera, et cetera. So you see enormous amounts of peaceful coexistence within Israel. Do we have a massive, enormous problem within the areas known as Gaza And you can call it either Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, whichever term you want to use. Of course, yeah, you've got within those areas, you have what is the longest standing refugee problem in human history. So now we need to start to deconstruct, why has the human family been able to resolve every other refugee problem in all of human history, has been resolved faster than this one. This is the longest ongoing refugee crisis in human history. Now, why is that? And what are the forces behind that? And so what I would say, and I'm sorry, Mike, I'm rambling on, so cut me off at any time. But
this
what
is
I
good.
Would,
this is why we have you on.
What I would say is the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Palestinian conflict, it's easy to come at it with emotion. It's white colonialist European settlers, right? And then you go there and anything but. I mean, you've got Yemenite Jews and Iraqi Jews and Ethiopian Jews. I mean, I don't know if it's the majority, but a huge population of the Jewish population of Israel are people of color. Many of them have lived there 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. They go back 1,000 years, tracing their lineage there. So these are the facts on the ground that make this a genuinely complex situation. And it requires those of us who are willing, again, to have common sense, who are willing to approach this not through a hyped up political extremist agenda. It requires us to do the hard work of looking at a term that I love, which is the term nuance. There is nuance here, there is complexity here. These wonderful people on both sides, the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, everybody's there. They deserve a mature, nuanced, common sense approach to this reality.
And that was also well said. And I actually think it's a good point to those who are listening to this and those who are watching as well to sort of heed those words, which is, as we move forward and no doubt get into some thorny issues, it's important to almost leave your preconceptions on the floor, because there is so much misunderstanding about that region. And the reason I brought up the example of you haven't been there for 30 years is it's kind of akin to like practical. In the UK, before you can drive, you have to pass your theory test. You have to pass your practical test. Just a few days ago, someone came to me and they said, "I just passed my theory test," and I said, "Amazing." And they said, "I feel like I can drive," and I just reminded them, "You can't drive, because the theory is a world away from the practical." And I guess in the same way, having debates on Twitter and sort of retweeting certain things, glancing at the conflict, ever so often, is very different to engaging with it for 30 years and being drenched and soaked in the nuance. And that's important, because I actually think one of the questions we should ask folks who are spokespeople online is, have you been there? Because if they say no, quite frankly, I don't think they should speak on the issue. Not because their perspective isn't important, but it lacks the rich nuance needed to have a sort of really balanced, thoughtful conversation. And so that's why I wanted to have you on, because I thought, well, not only are you a sort of Christian Zionist that's written lots of books, but also you've lived and engaged with the people for so long. So let's start with that title, or the words that's in the title, right? Christian Zionist. What on earth is a Christian Zionist?
Right. And, titles and labels are both useful, and they also kind of become kind of a prison, so it's a toss-up. So I'm just as comfortable to call myself a human being who believes in fairness for all peoples, so I don't, it's not like I'm demanding to wear that title. I understand that title kind of comes with the territory, but let me just say this. If I was not a Christian, if I didn't read the Bible, but I was just a person with a basic moral code of live and let live and work for fairness and equity as much as possible with all peoples, my stand on Israel and the Palestinians and this issue, my stand after 32 years of being there, as you've said hundreds of times, deep friendships with the Muslim community, deep friendships with the Israeli community, my stand would be the same. So I think that's very, very important for me to state. I've actually stated that publicly many times. Again, Jerusalem brought me, Tel Aviv kept me. So if I didn't believe the Bible, but I just had seen what I've seen and experienced what I've experienced, my viewpoint, would be the same. I'll give you an example to your point earlier, asking people, well, have you been there, right? So, a big thing you hear about the checkpoints, and the checkpoints, and the Israelis force people to go through checkpoints, et cetera, et cetera. Well, first of all, when I come to the UK, I got to go through customs. Guess what? I got to go through a checkpoint. I mean, that's called when you leave one territory and enter another. That's what happens. All the more so when you've got the history that Israel has had. And I lived there during the Second Intifada, where literally, without exaggeration, almost every month, a bus was blowing up, a restaurant was blowing up, a hotel was blowing up. So, you live through that reality. Well, those realities are going to have repercussions. But let's go for a moment to the checkpoints, and then I'll come back to your question about the term Christian Zionist. October 7th, the October 7th massacre, and I was there. I was there in Jerusalem on October 7th. I was there for the first 6 days of the war. What people fail to realize, at the checkpoints, these evil, horrific Israeli checkpoints, prior to October 7th, Israel was allowing every single day tens of thousands of workers from Gaza were allowed into Israel every single day to work, to earn a living, to support their families, and to support the economy of Gaza, which has been a difficult place. Now, and you can fact check me on this. I'm gonna be honest enough to say I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm about 90% sure about this. Egypt, I don't believe, allows any Gazans into Egypt. Now, Egypt also shares a border with Gaza, which is something very few people talk about. Right? Why is the burden of humanitarian aid and all of these things only on the Israeli border when Egypt equally shares a border with Gaza, and by the way, shares the same language, shares primarily the same religion, if you want to think in terms of Islam. But prior to October 7th, for sure, Israel's allowing thousands and thousands of Gazans into Israel who had work permits, who were working, who were supporting their families, through what? The checkpoints. So now, one of the humanitarian crises that is created, all of those Gazans lost their jobs. Now there's a shutdown of income and of those families being provided for, and of the economy of Gaza being strengthened. Why? What is Israel going to do? They have to shut down those checkpoints, obviously, now at this moment. So again, these go to the misconceptions and the facts that people simply are not aware of, and the reality on the ground. So to your point, I'll be speaking publicly often, and people will start screaming about the checkpoints. I'll say, well, how many times have you been through a checkpoint? Because I've been through a checkpoint hundreds of times, hundreds and hundreds of times. And the vast majority of the time, those checkpoints are open, people are flowing through. Yes, there's occasional security checks, as there are I go through airports in America, and I'm the highest level clearance that you can have. Like not only do I have TSA, I have global entry, I have clear, I have all the entries, and guess what? About once every 10 trips, it'll ding, and they'll say, oh, sorry, Mr. Stearns, you've been chosen for a random security check. Could you come over here? You've been elected you need to go through this process. That's called the real world. But when you twist this and you demonize it, we have these things. Okay, back to Christian Zionist. Let's start with the term Zionist. I don't even like that term necessarily. What that is saying this. The French should be allowed to live in France. The Italians should be allowed to live in Italy. People should be allowed to live in their ancestral indigenous homeland. The Jews should be allowed to live in Judea, or the greater area of Israel. This is their ancestral homeland. They've been displaced from it several times throughout history, but even when they were displaced, there has been an uninterrupted Jewish presence in Israel, in Judea and Samaria, in the Holy Land, uninterrupted since King David's time. And so they should have a right to live there. If you want to call that Zionism, call it Zionism. I call it that people should be allowed to live in their indigenous homelands, and then they should be able to govern how that homeland is run, how that homeland functions. They should be able to govern their immigration policy. They should be able to govern the things that pertain to that home. It's kind of ridiculous that you have to say these things because they're so self-evident. So add to that the term Christian, which would say that as a Christian informed by the Bible, that there are unique promises or prophecies or covenants that God has made with Israel, with the Jewish people, with that land. And do I believe that? Yes, I believe that. I'm a Christian. I'm not a Hindu. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian. And so I believe that. But that doesn't, for me, if I didn't believe that, I would still believe that Guatemalans should be able to live in Guatemala and run Guatemala as they see fit. And so now when we go to, let me pause there because I was going to go, what I'd like to do is go to 1947 and 48. But before I go there, let me remind you that you're running the interview. So I want you to ask the questions that you want.
I mean, it's good because you'll go into the places I would have went, because I guess, a pushback you might get as well, if we're talking about that narrow piece of land, well, Palestinians, to a certain degree, some have their, lineage going back hundreds of years, some might say. And so they would equally claim a right to that territory too. So if you've got them saying, well, just as you believe in self-determination and self-governance for folks who trace their lineage back to King David, what about us who trace our lineage back to whatever point in history? Is there a point at which we shouldn't be able to have self-determination?
Right. So absolutely. I think the response is that Israel has not in any way denied the Palestinian or Arab population to live in that land. Listen, 20% of the state of Israel are Palestinian Arabs. 20%. And Mike, we have to ask a very interesting question right now, and then I'll come back. 20%, there's almost 2 million Arabs, mostly Muslim, not all, some Christian Muslims, but mostly Muslims, living full rights as Israeli citizens. We have to ask this question. Hamas is attacking from Gaza. The Houthis are attacking from Yemen. Hezbollah is attacking from Lebanon, backed by Syria. Iran is attacking via rockets. Here's a question. If Israel is this demonic, horrific, tyrannical power who's ruling over these 2 million Muslims, why haven't we seen 20% of Israel's population say, wow, now is our time for an uprising. Now is our time to get out into the streets and get violent and take back our land. Now is our time to throw off these oppressors, because we've got Hamas and we've got the Houthis and we've got Hezbollah and we've got Iran. Let's rise up and throw out. Why have we not seen 2 million Israeli Arabs? This is their moment. This is their moment to rise up and throw off the oppressor. Why isn't that happening? And I want to submit to you, the reason it's not happening is because those Israeli Arabs deeply understand that their quality of life and freedom is exponentially and existentially better than any Arab has in Iran, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria. Go through all the surrounding Islamic, mostly dictatorship nations. Egypt. The Israeli Arabs living inside Israel, who this could be their moment. If Israel is this demonic, horrific, bloodthirsty, genocidal power, there is, you're getting me excited. The preacher in me is coming out. There's no greater moment than right now for these 2 million Israeli Arabs to rise up and throw off the Israeli oppressor. And you know what? You're not seeing it happen. You're not seeing it happen. Why? Because their level of rights, freedoms, income, every other Arab nation, freedom for women, women's rights, rights for social minorities like the gay community, freedom of the press, voting rights, all of these things Israeli Arabs know that they have. So Israel is not in any way denying Palestinians or Arabs living within the state of Israel, nor is Israel denying in Gaza or Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, denying them living there. Israel withdrew from Gaza in, I think it was 2005, 2006. Israel completely withdrew from Gaza. There was not a soldier.
Yes, some pushback people might have, if you let me, just really quickly, is, so, I mean, you speak about, is Arabs, say, or Muslims, who, we don't know, of course, who live in Israel. Well, some might say, well, they're living there because it's convenient to live there, but that's still a different conversation to what they believe is morally right? So what they think should happen. So to those who might say, well, the reason why Gaza is such a terrible place to live is because right now it's being bombed by Israel. They might say even when Israel withdrew in 2004 there, Israel still controlled sort of water supply, electricity, still had these checkpoints. And so essentially there was a stranglehold, some might say, was put on Gaza. And so some would say Israel has been the architect of where Gaza is right now today. And so for that reason, they might say, well, how could you speak about Israel being the sort of great place to live and be? That's only because of what they're doing to subjugate sort of Gaza. I mean, what would you say in response to something like that? Because that is what a lot of people, at least here, believe.
So I would say that it is not any nation's responsibility to moderate and struggling to find the right word. It's not any nation's responsibility to produce morally clear thinkers in another nation. That's the responsibility of that people to produce that. And let me explain what I mean by that. The bishop that I followed in our church in New York, Bishop Tommy Reed, he's still alive. He's going to be 93 in a couple of weeks. He's an amazing, iconic figure. He's been known all over the world. He had a close friendship with Anwar Sadat. For those who might not remember from history, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt who at first consistently went to war with Israel, consistently opposed Israel, and then had a moral awakening and realized that the pathway that he was on was only going to result in increased bloodshed on both sides of the conflict. And so with extraordinary courage and moral clarity, Anwar Sadat traveled to Jerusalem and forged peace with the state of Israel. Not long after he did so, and I should say the peace that he forged between Egypt and Israel lasts until this day. Until this day. Sometimes the relations are warmer, sometimes they're colder, but there is peace between Egypt and Israel, and there's cooperation between Egypt and Israel. There are Israelis who vacation in parts of Egypt and vice versa. Okay, there is a level of normalization between what used to be an arch enemy and Egypt. Not long after he brokered that peace deal, he was assassinated by radical Islam. Not long after his death, his widow, Mrs. Sadat, came to visit us here in New York. She came and spent 3 days with Bishop Reed and his wife. And Bishop Reed asked Mrs. Sadat, he said to her, what was it like the day your husband died? Did you have an intuition? Did you think? What happened? What was that experience? And Mrs. Sadat said this. She said, "Oh, we knew that he was going to die. He knew when he signed the peace deal with Israel that he was going to pay for it with his life. But he felt that by laying his life down, it would save countless thousands of other lives. And so he willingly," and she said, he saw the assassin approaching and he stood up and took the bullet with pride because he knew what he was laying his life down for. So the point is this, Mike. When Israel left Gaza, within days, rockets began falling on Israel. So we can talk all we want to talk about electricity and blockades and everything else. Egypt shares a border with Gaza. It is not Israel's moral responsibility to create moral thought leaders like an Anwar Sadat in another nation. Look at the textbooks in Gaza. Look at the textbooks in the Palestinian territories. They demonize Israel. First of all, they don't even call Israel by name. They call it the Zionist entity. And their maps do not include Israel. There is nothing within the Palestinian societies that are controlled by Hamas or influenced by Hamas or Hezbollah, nothing, zero, that actually engages towards the thought of coexistence. And so within days of leaving Gaza, rockets are falling down upon Israel. And by the way, Mike, I also lay blame not only at the hands of Hamas, I lay blame at the hands of the international community. Because the international community continues to fund billions and billions of dollars. There has been so much money thrown at this situation that every Palestinian probably, I'd have to do the math, but probably each of them could have received $1 million by now. But do you know where that money is gone? That money is gone to the pockets of people like Anwar Sadat, whose widow now lives in Paris with billions in her bank account. It's gone to fund the rulers of Hamas, 2 of which are now dead, who have greater net worth than Donald Trump. Greater net worth than the royal family. The leaders of Hamas sit in Qatar, nowhere near their supposed people. By the way, Ismail Hanani, who was just killed, was born in Egypt and died in Iran. Born in Egypt, lived in Qatar, and died in Iran. Explain to me how he's a Palestinian freedom fighter. He's born in Egypt, lived in Qatar, and died in Iran. How is he fighting for Palestinian rights? So until you dig deeper and understand that significant parts of the radicalized Muslim world, and I am not speaking about, we're not speaking about Muslims, we're speaking about a specific branch of radicalized, but unfortunately there's a lot of them. Estimates put it at about 100 million that are well funded. They are consistently filling and brainwashing a younger generation within Gaza, within the West Bank, with this kind of ideology. Mike, the UK, and I think not all, but many of your listeners are from the UK, and they're younger, but they're old enough to remember in history. Listen, the Nazi youth believed Hitler. They believed him. Propaganda and brainwashing, when you start young enough, manages to literally brainwash a generation. And so tragically and horrifically, you have significant portions of young people who believe, if I kill myself in a suicide bombing, I'm going to immediately go to Allah and have 72 virgins. And by the way, the Palestinian Authority to this day pays over $100,000 a year to the family of suicide bombers in perpetuity. So my family is now going to be wealthy. My family is now going to be esteemed. This is the reality of what we are dealing with among a population that has been brainwashed. And it is not Israel's responsibility, nor do I understand how it would be in the realm of possibility, to create, you have to create Anwar Sadats. And instead we have Ismail Hananis, and I'm pronouncing his name wrong. But this is the problem we have. Until we have Martin Luther King Jr.'s, until we have Nelson Mandela's, until we have Mahatma Gandhi's, until we have Anwar Sadats, who are willing to lead the Palestinian people towards a path of peaceful coexistence, we're going to continue to have this problem.
It just dawned on me that we have to do this again because we've run out of time. I want to be respectful of your time. I mean, there's so much I want to explore. One is understanding more about the sort of context and texture of Hamas, what the end goal is. But also, I do want to understand, and maybe this is where we'll end for today at least, is there's many charges leveled at Israel. And I think we've at no stage spoken about the IDF today. We've at no stage spoken about Benjamin Netanyahu and what he's doing. We've at no stage. We're speaking very theoretically. But the difficulty I find is some people find it very difficult to have a conversation about what should happen when they look at their TV screens. Allegedly, there's 30,000 Palestinians dead and 14,000 are said to be kids. When you've got such visceral images on your screens of people dying, of pain, of death, of decay, it's very hard to have a conversation about a two-state solution when your eyes are filled with rage. So what would you say about everything we're seeing on our screens, those death counts that seem to go up, bombing campaign after bombing campaign, you know, Palestinians who are seeing their loved ones blown to pieces? You know, I mean, for a lot of people, it's just too emotional for them to engage in a sort of rational way. And so I wonder if you'd speak to that and how you see that from your engagement. Having seen, I imagine, lots of terrible scenes yourself, how do you still ensure you're not cold and rational about it? Or, you know, maybe we'll have you speak to that as we wrap up this chapter.
Well, first of all, war is hell. You know, I mean, again, let's go back to World War II and the devastation that was brought to Great Britain, and then the devastation that, you know, Great Britain and the Allies had to bring to Germany because we were fighting evil. People want to talk about a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas broke. These are facts. This is a matter of historic record. There were 6 ceasefires that Hamas broke. 6 ceasefires, going back years, that Hamas broke and attacked. Israel raises their children with their children needing to run into bomb shelters in an ongoing way, because it is a regular occurrence for rockets to be fired over from Gaza or from the north. What kind of PTSD is that going to create in a nation who consistently are living under the threat of people who want to annihilate them? Golda Meir said this. Golda Meir said it's very difficult to negotiate with people whose only goal is to kill you. So, talking about death toll, first of all, it's horrific. It's hellish. It's horrible. War is hell. If you don't want casualties of war, don't start a war. If you don't want casualties of war, don't start a war. Israel has offered a 2-state solution to the Palestinian leadership on 7 different occasions since 1947. The partition plan of November 29th, 1947, which was legally voted on in the United Nations in full view of the family of nations, full view and participation of all the family of nations, overwhelmingly passed, and it created 2 states. It created a state for the Jewish population and a state for the Arab population. Israel agreed to the 2-state solution in 1947, and Israel has agreed to it 7 times since then. In 2000, it was either 2000 or 2001, Bill Clinton sat with Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat at Camp David. And I have 2 close personal friends who were a part of the negotiating team. I've spoken with them at length. Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat 97%. These are facts, Mike. These are incontrovertible facts of history. Ehud Olmert offered Yasser Arafat 97% of the land territory that they were requesting, and billions of dollars for the 3% that Israel was not willing to give. And Bill Clinton, to be honest, very much, you know, and I think he would admit this, I think very much driven by his ego, because this was Bill Clinton's opportunity to have his legacy in history. Bill Clinton is saying to Arafat over and over again, how are you not accepting this? And Arafat said this. Arafat said, if I take this deal, they'll kill me. If I take this deal, they'll kill me. So now we get to the genuine point of this. Is Hamas, is Hezbollah, are any of these actually looking for peace? Mike, respectfully, you're a younger man than I am. Respectfully to the younger generation has a tendency to not remember that evil exists. There are forces in this world who are genuinely evil and genuinely bent on destruction. I have been in Israel for 32 years. For 32 years, thousands upon thousands of times I have heard this phrase from my Jewish Israeli friends. Thousands upon thousands of times I've heard this. All we want is to live in peace with our neighbors. The heart and tenor of the Jewish state is to live in peaceful coexistence. If Israel laid down its weapons tomorrow, there would be no more state of Israel. They would be overrun and annihilated and exterminated by Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. If Hamas, Hezbollah laid down, forget Iran, that's a separate issue. If just Hamas and Hezbollah laid down their weapons tomorrow, there would be the creation of a Palestinian state. Israel has agreed to it over and over and over again. Is it going to be 100% of the territory? No, it's not. Is there going to have to be discussion about borders and what do you do with the settlers? Of course, that's called negotiations. That's called what people driven by genuine justice and fairness engage in. They engage in negotiations and compromise to find peaceful solutions. And until Israel has a genuine partner within the Palestinian community, until there is a Anwar Sadat or a Nelson Mandela or a Mahatma Gandhi or a Martin Luther King Jr., and 3 of those 4 paid for it with their life, and Nelson Mandela paid for it with, I think, 37 years in prison. Until one of those rise up, unfortunately, we're going to have the continuation of this conflict.
I mean, that's a very sort of somber place to end, because that is where probably we'll pick up when we next speak, is about what does resolution look like, and where do we lend our collective energy? Because it's one thing to, post online and sort of call for a 2-state solution, or say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. These sort of kind of taglines and engagements. But for those who, as you said, are really interested in justice, are really interested in sort of fairness, it would be interesting to explore what to do and what they can do and how they can stay involved, even when this inevitably moves out of the headlines and people move on to something else. There will be a remnant. There will be some people who want to stay engaged and stay informed. And so I think that's what we'll explore next. But I mean, thank you so much. I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for lending your energy to this conversation. I think it's been really eye-opening, and I think for some listening, they will no doubt let us know what they think as well as we continue this engagement. But is there anything you'd like to sort of say before we kind of move on?
Well, I would just invite those who are interested in engaging. I'd invite them to connect with me on social media. I do think that I bring kind of a unique first-hand perspective because I'm there so often. I'll be there 4 times this year. I was there on October 7th. So they can find me online at Robert R. Stearns on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook. Those are the 3 platforms I engage on the most. I just honor you, Mike, I honor you for not falling into the trap of the algorithm. And this is I have a good friend, Mark Gerson, and Mark says, what we desperately need right now is the principled center. The principled center is what we're missing right now, and I think the global conversation. And it's a little terrifying, the way that society is being driven to such extremes. We're about to enter in America into, without question, the most extreme election of our nation's history. It's inconceivable to me that these are our 2 choices for president, because it's literally the absolute extremes. And so I just honor you as a thought leader, because it's not so sexy to stay in the middle, right? It's a lot easier to grow a following and to, fear sells, right? Like fear sells. But you're doing the hard and mature work of drawing us towards, again, that thing called the principled center. So I love the name of the podcast, Common Sense. That is what the world needs now is common sense. So keep bringing it, Mike.
Well, hopefully you come back and we can explore this in more detail. But thank you so much for being here, and speak soon.